I did my research in a first grade classroom at the Jewish Community Day School of Greater Boston, and it is a case study of one particular student in the classroom. So my research question was, what differentiation strategies support this English language learner's learning in science within the context of the greater class? And within that research question, I also wanted to explore, when implementing science lessons, what teaching moves serve this ELL while continuing to meet the needs of the class. So I want to talk a little bit about my question origins. I became interested in ELL programs in my previous master's program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I learned a lot about ELL programs, and it was a really contentious argument in the classroom. But for me, I had never been exposed to that because I'd spent my whole life in Jewish day school. We didn't have any ELL students. In my 2 years of public high school, I was in a public high school in Bangor, Maine, where the class was 98% white. So it was just never anything I was exposed to. So when I joined this program, I never thought, okay, well, that was really interesting last year, but ELL considerations are not going to exist in the Jewish day school, so why should it concern me? Well, I was wrong. In my first grade classroom, we had a boy from Israel, and he had no English when he came in. So I needed to write a science unit on living things that accounted for him as well as a group of diverse learners. So the case study, who is this child I'm talking about? I'm going to be calling him Lior. He was a 7-year-old boy who moved from Israel to the United States the summer before school started. He had limited English proficiency. He didn't speak a lot, except for a lot of okays to sort of say, this is what I'm understanding. Something that was really interesting about him was he was really good at decoding. So you could say the word water, and he'd be able to get most of the letters W-A-T-R. Did he know what water meant? No, he didn't have that comprehension. So we really did have to focus on that, which was something I had to consider in my science lessons. And something else that's really important is that he was well adjusted with his peers. He got along wonderfully with all the other students, so that wasn't a concern that we had in the classroom. So what were these specific interventions I had immediately starting within this unit? First of all, I had high expectations for this student. He needed to know right off the bat that two things. First, that even though he doesn't speak English well, he's still going to do my work, and that he's going to be expected to work at the same expectations as the other students. Something else I did for Lior was to allow him to complete work in both Hebrew and English. The research shows, prior to actually looking at the literature I used for this particular question, is that when you have the native language, you should really use the native language in order to help that English come to be. So if you don't build the Hebrew skills, and he was still working on his grammar, he's in first grade, then the English is not going to come as easily. Something that was really helpful, and I actually saw this in the literature later, but I didn't know that this would be an accommodation necessarily, was that it's really important to preview and review directions before sending these students to complete a task. They can be sitting there when you have 22 students in the classroom, you think they understand, he shakes his head a lot, okay, but you have to make sure he understands, and he has to repeat back some of the things he's going to do. I also would have him work in group settings at JCDS. It's actually sort of a bilingual school, so we really encourage both Hebrew and English being spoken, and we have a lot of Israelis. So there were a lot of students who could just speak in his native language and also translate for him, which would be really helpful. So my preliminary findings. With the pre-assessment and early lessons, I learned that. So compared to his peers, Lior had little prior knowledge of living things. So for example, I had all the students complete a cover for their living things journals. I said, just draw any living things you want. So he drew an animal, and a lot of the kids did people and plants. He drew SpongeBob and a television set. So immediately I knew, okay, he has a different schema for living things, and we really need to work with that. And I also learned that even though there were some assignments that didn't involve any English at all, any speaking or any writing in English, he still struggled with that. So for example, relevant details lesson, all he had to do was draw the object, and he'd come back every 5 minutes saying, am I done yet? Am I done yet? And I'd say, od pratim, more details, more details. And so that was something I learned early on. So what did I do? I continued with interventions. Even though something doesn't necessarily work in the beginning, you have to keep trying it so the students get used to it. I also added additional accommodations, and what was really special about these accommodations is they're also useful for other students in the classroom. So what were these additional accommodations? First of all, promoting a democratic classroom. It's really important because all the students have to feel like they're safe in the classroom, that they can contribute. They have to be able to listen to each other and share ideas. And it just involves all that participation and really high expectations. And this is something I wanted for all of my students. I also learned, this is something I really took for granted, that you teach the content before implementing accommodations. I never thought of that as an accommodation. So for example, when we found out that Lior thought SpongeBob was a living thing, we sort of talked to him about why he thought that. He also thought plants weren't living. He didn't know that he thought the sun and water were living. So there was a lot of things that we had to work with, some things that we had to really build that foundation so he could be on par with the rest of the students. I was teaching terms like community and ecosystems, and really this is important for ELL students just as it is for all my students. I really needed to simplify my language so they would learn these terms, and I also would do things like simulations where they'd act out being in an ecosystem, and that was actually really powerful. And not only did Lior understand that, which I garnered from assessments, but all my students were really that was really helpful for all of them. And finally, utilize available resources. So for example, I had this timer that I set for 15 minutes. I had certain students who would rush through drawing. I said, you do not get out of your seat until this timer is up. And I didn't think of that as an accommodation originally for Lior, but it happened to be a really wonderful one for him, and it was helpful for him as well as a lot of his other students. And it was a resource, it's just a timer. And finally, I used my knowledge of Lior as a learner, which I really, a lot of time watching him, speaking with other people, just really understanding who he was, and I would adjust my expectations accordingly for him. So what were the results? First, Lior learned all these key concepts, the content knowledge and skills. In a conversation I had with him a week after the unit, I just decided to go up to him and said, Lior, so tell me about SpongeBob. Is he living? He said, oh, absolutely not. No, of course not. And I said, okay, how about plants? He says, yes, they're living. And I said, why are they living? He says, well, they breathe and they eat and they move. He gave me a list, all the characteristics, which was wonderful because that's what I had taught. And also the same with the sun and water. He could answer all that for me. And also, he was doing a lot of the skills like working like a scientist, which were really important. His work ethic improved. So first one I kept saying, Ode pratim, that was the first day. But the next day, he actually really sat there and he understood, okay, like I can't, look around, I have to pay attention, there's these expectations for me, and he did all the work, and it was really impressive to watch. He took more risks in writing in English, so even though I allowed him to use both Hebrew and English, and at first he would mostly write 2 words in Hebrew or 3 words in Hebrew, I have this one assignment where he just wrote like a page of English, and I think he worked with the resource teacher, but he's really good at decoding, and he had more comprehension because he had words like water we had on our word wall that he was able to spell and know that it meant Mayan. So he understood that. And finally, he spoke more English in all subjects, and overall, that silent period for him had really ended, and what was really powerful was actually during our Japan unit, which happened immediately after we had a little quiz to see what the students had learned, and he had said all these things in English. We had no idea he was capable of speaking so much academic English, and it was really exciting to see. And just overall, he was speaking more English with his peers, and he just seemed more comfortable with taking risks in academic subjects. So what are my takeaways? So, first of all, teaching moves do not need to be limited to the single student. So it's really hard. How are you going to make 22 lesson plans? It's just not going to happen, or you'll go crazy. So you really need to think what's going to work for all of your diverse learners, including your ELL students, your special needs students, your gifted children. You really need to figure out what's going to work for all of them. And something else I learned is I'm really happy. I have this toolbox of accommodations that I tried out, I tested, I also learned from the literature. But in the end, there's a one-size-fits-all approach to accommodations is unlikely to be effective because you have to consider each student's unique background and needs before implementing these accommodations. So some accommodations are going to work for some students, others might not. There might be something better for another student, and I need to be prepared for that and be reflective on what's going to work for my specific student and really know them as the individual learners that they are.